Hi everyone, welcome to the Whiteleyverse with me, Connor Whiteley, for another daily short story. Now, before I start today's story, please remember to like, comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content, and the engagement really helps the Whiteleyverse with the YouTube algorithm. Also, if you want to buy this short story and any of my other fiction, then they're available from all major ebook retailers and at your local bookstore and local library if you requested, and you can order paperback copies from Amazon. Now, here's today's short story. I hope you enjoyed just as much as I did writing it.
Criminal Performance. The 20th of August, 2022. Canterbury, England. Private Eye Bettie English had seen some stunning performances at various theatres all over the United Kingdom. She had seen the breathtaking opera in London, amazing comedies that made her stomach hurt for days on end afterwards in Edinburgh, and she had seen the sweetest little production done by children for the various charities that she gave money to. But this performance was just criminally bad. Bettie sat on a very comfortable little red seat in the circle of the Bluebird Theatre in Canterbury. This was probably the best seat she had ever had because its delightful softness, a black cup holder in the arm that was actually large enough to hold her Diet Coke, and the seat was dead center in line with the middle of the stage. The large-ish black stage itself wasn't exactly grand. It was probably nothing more than some wooden blocks stuck together to give a very convincing look-alike, to trick people into believing it was a professional stage, but Bettie just knew better. The smell of sweat, peanuts and amazingly rich bitter coffee filled the air, and Bettie was so looking forward to next month when she gave birth to her twins, and she could finally have some of the delightful black gold again. She had really missed her coffee. The roar below in the stalls came from tens upon tens of proud parents shouting, laughing and pretending to enjoy the performance going on the stage. Bettie wasn't sure if they were actually faking it or pretending, or Bettie certainly was. Currently on the stage were a group of 3 to 4-year-old toddlers with a pop song on in the background, and from what Bettie could understand, the toddlers were meant to be dancing, judging by the adult dressed in black, moving around trying to encourage the toddlers to do the same. But come on, they were toddlers. Bettie had absolutely no expectation that they were going to dance, sing or whatever. Bettie just smiled as she heard her wonderful boyfriend Graham next to her huff. Clearly he was just as sad about the lack of performance as she was. He was probably just too kind to say anything. Then next to the other side was Bettie's sister Phryne, in her little black dress cheering, shouting and clapping at the little toddlers. Bettie wasn't exactly impressed that her sister had basically tricked her into coming along to this performance for the charity she gave her time to. Bettie had never ever known her sister to be charitable in the slightest. Hell, this was the exact same sister who didn't really seem interested that her son Sean and his boyfriend Harry were living with Bettie, rather than his own mother after they were attacked and Harry had a brain injury. Now everyone please clap your hands together for the amazing, the stunning, the spectacular Thomas High School's girls, someone said over the microphone. Thankfully the little toddlers who looked so scared and concerned hurried off, even though one didn't understand what was going on. So she was walking towards the edge of the rather high-up stage. An adult grabbed her and they all left. A few moments later, some 5 to 6 years olds, Bettie had no idea how they were classed as high school girls, came onto the stage dressed in rather inappropriate clothing for that age or any age really. Bettie rested her hands on her baby bump. Please tell me you two aren't going to be into this show stuff. Bettie almost jerked at the baby kicks, and Bettie just smiled at her 2 beautiful babies. She firmly took that as a no, and she more than loved them for it. Of course, if the twins had wanted to do this, then she would have let them. But she preferred them not to, for now anyway. Miss Bettie English, a woman said in the darkness. It took Bettie a few moments to realize that there was a middle-aged woman dressed in all black, standing right next to her. It was so dark in the theater Bettie was struggling to see her own baby bump, let alone someone dressed in all black. Yes, Bettie said, still not being able to see the woman clearly. Are you the private eye woman? She asked. Betty rolled her eyes at the sheer dismissiveness that the woman said it with. I am.
Great, the woman said and leant closer to Betty.
We need your help, please. There is a situation that we cannot call the police about. Can you please help us? My boss has authorized the transfer of £1,000 as compensation. Normally Betty would have at least pretended to consider not taking the job, because of course she was with the family she loved, watching a cute little child performance and supporting a charity she loved. Absolutely none of that was true in the slightest. Betty grabbed the woman's hand and shook it hard. She was going to take any old excuse to get out of here. She quickly told beautiful Graham what she was doing, and he just stuck his tongue out at her in jealousy. Betty didn't blame him, but at least she was escaping. But the theatre wanted to give her £1,000. That was a lot of money for a few hours of work. Betty was more concerned about the case than she ever wanted to admit. A few minutes later, the middle-aged woman, which admittedly had seen better days, with her oversized body, that was putting such a strain on her black uniform that Betty was waiting for the buttons to explode off, led Betty into a bright white storage room that was a bit on the small size for a very overweight woman and a heavily pregnant woman to get into too. Betty really wasn't a fan of its bright white walls, musty smell of sweat, and Betty even saw a very well-used condom on the floor, so she could only imagine what this room was actually used for. Yet what really caught Betty's attention was the makeshift desk, covered in papers, and the grey metal filing cabinet that had been forced open. This is the problem, Miss English, the middle-aged woman said, pointing to the forced open filing cabinet. As much as Betty wanted to focus on the filing cabinet, she was a lot more interested in all the papers on the desk. It was strange how the criminal or thief, or whatever, had gone to the filing cabinet when there was clearly so much paperwork on the desk. What happened? Betty said as she looked through the paperwork on the desk. This is my storage room and office, the woman said. And my name is Miss Savannah Clare. Before every performance I exit my office, lock it before I go and meet the production crew to double-check everything is ready. Betty nodded as she was reading the bank account information and passwords on the desk. It was stupid that the theatre would leave their bloody banking passwords in the open, but she wasn't their investor or anything to do with them. It was still stupid. I leave my office at 1:30, and I checked with the production crew. Then I watched the opening performance of the show at 2. I just had to leave after that, Savannah said. Betty couldn't exactly blame her too much. If she had been smarter, Betty would have realized then that the pointless opening of the performance with a mixture of toddlers, who didn't know what to do and were too nervous because of the crowds, and older children, looked more like a chaotic catfight, more than a so-called elegant performance. Then I came back to my office, and found the filing cabinet open. Betty could only nod as she found another cold piece of paper that detailed out the theatre's business plan, taxes and employee passwords. This was beyond stupid now, and it was a wonder that the theatre hadn't been robbed before. But why leave this information and not take it? Betty looked at Savannah and folded her arms. What was stolen? Savannah looked to the ground. Someone stole the scripts of a brand new West End performance coming down from London. This performance would have put the theatre on the national and international map. Betty wasn't sure about that, but if a little theatre like this could host such a massive performance that would have had positive reviews, be critically acclaimed, and have some great stars, then it would definitely be a boon to the theatre. And most importantly, the person who worked in there. Betty quickly realized that this theft wasn't about money or anything like that, it was about sabotaging the livelihoods of the people that worked here. Betty picked up the recent bank documents off the desk and reread them, and the theatre was cash strapped up to their necks. They had maxed out all their credit cards, and the theatre probably had 2 months left at best. Can you help us? Savannah asked. Betty didn't react and just went over to the filing cabinet, had stunk of strawberry lube, sweat, and a very strange earthy aftershave that Betty hadn't smelt in a long time. She had bought it for Graham years ago before they broke up, and he had hated it. He actually had an allergic reaction so bad, Betty had to take him to hospital. Besides from that, the filing cabinet, well, that drawer that had been forced open anyway, was perfectly clear. Then Betty focused on the 2 marks where something had been forced into the drawer to pop it open. It looked like a simple crowbar job, but that was a little too simple for Betty's liking. "Do you keep crowbars in the theater?" Betty asked. Savannah nodded and pointed under the desk. Betty rolled her eyes as she popped her head under the makeshift desk and saw an entire toolkit. She didn't want to know why Savannah had all of these tools, but she guessed Savannah was also a part-time handywoman too. This place was really cash-strapped. Betty folded her arms again. She had some scripts stolen, no evidence in the filing cabinet. The breaking into the filing cabinet was done with Savannah's tools, so that proved nothing, and there were no clues in this storage room. Betty was at a dead end. Is it possible for people to get into the theater during a performance? Betty asked. Savannah looked a little annoyed at even the suggestion. Of course not. That is ridiculous. The theater has had thefts before, but I will not allow them anymore. I make sure this place is secure. Betty actually believed her, and at least the dead end meant she was going to be working a little longer, so she didn't have to go back to the god-awful performance. But Betty did have a critical lead now. If no one could get in, it had to be an inside job. And that made Betty even more curious about who it could be. Was it one of the proud parents watching their kids in the stalls, or was it a staff member? Betty was really looking forward to finding out. The sheer dirtiness of the little box room that apparently served as the security office only told Betty more and more about how dire the situation was for the theater. The security room was caked in dirt and dust, and smelt like some teens had had a pizza party without bothering to clean it up. Betty really tried to focus on the little computer screen in front of Savannah as she showed Betty the security footage. Betty was going to do this bit herself, but there was no chance in hell she was going to sit down in this room. And much less touch the wooden desk with the computer on. Betty could see the grease covering the surface. Betty was actually starting to wonder if the theater closing down might be a benefit to the local area. It would be, at least from a public health perspective. "This is the security camera outside my office," Savannah said. Betty was surprised Savannah thought these cameras would be useful. There was such a thick layer of ugly dust and grime on the camera lens that Betty could hardly see the office door, let alone any details of the thin figures, presumably people walking past. This was another dead end. Betty was really not impressed now. It was almost like Savannah had purposefully kept the theater in such a bad condition that it was useless to investigate if any crimes occurred. Maybe that was the play. "Bring up all employees in today, please," Betty said. Savannah nodded and typed away at her computer a little. She brought up the employment records, and Betty was right about Savannah doing a lot of different jobs. She was the manager, handywoman, and occasional extra if a play needed it. Betty admired this woman's resilience and lust to throw herself into everything that the theater required of her. But Betty also knew that this was where people tended to go to the criminal side of humanity, out of annoyance, spite, or another reason altogether. "Where's the script, Savannah?" Betty asked. Savannah huffed. "I respect you too much, miss, to lie to you. You didn't know it, but you were the first person in a long, long time to at least talk to me like I'm a person. And not some superhuman." Betty had no idea she spoke to Savannah in a special way. She was just doing what she always did. "How long have you been a one-woman band?" Betty asked. Savannah didn't seem like she could look at Betty. At least she probably felt bad for her actions. "Ever since last Christmas, I have had to reduce staff levels by a factor of 10. I've been repairing, fixing and cleaning, believe it or not, every day." Betty found the cleaning comment hard to believe, but to interrupt would just seem rude. "I've been doing 16-hour shifts every day this year. Finding stupid performances to put on, not paying myself living wage, and it is just so trying." Betty folded her arms.
"What do the owners say?"
"Have you told them?" Savannah glared at Betty. "You think I want this 16-hour stuff? I don't. I really don't. My bosses tell me if I don't comply I'll be fired. I'll be on the streets. They own my apartment." Betty gently placed her hands on her baby bump. This case was never what it had seemed in the first place. This wasn't a strictly criminal act, it was a call for help. And Betty actually wanted to help this poor woman. She needed to get the cops involved. She needed Graham. A few hours later, Betty and Savannah leant against the wonderful warm brick wall of a shop on the delightfully perfect cobblestone high street of Canterbury, as they watched Graham escort a middle-aged man and woman down the high street towards his police car with 2 uniformed officers closely behind him. Other people, as they strolled up and down the high street on this wonderful evening, muttered and looked and spoke about what was going on. Betty laughed at some of the guesses like drugs, murder or kidnapping.
But the truth was a lot sadder.
As a private eye and doing a lot of charity work too, Betty had always known about modern slavery, but this was the first time she had ever encountered it, and it was the last time she ever wanted to. Despite the sensational buttery creamy, sweetest scents coming from the various bakeries on the high street, Betty felt so sorry for Savannah. A woman who had been kicked out by her husband, because she refused to put up with his drinking and shouting anymore. A woman who had been on the streets for months before 2 people offered her a way to freedom. A woman who had been tricked into believing enslavement was a freedom. As Savannah watched with cold, distant eyes at Graham walking away her captors, Betty focused on her. For the past year and a bit, her captors had forced her to live in a tiny little apartment on an awful wage in awful conditions. They controlled everything about her life, but because Savannah loved the theater so much, she didn't notice until it was far too late. Then the scripts for the best-selling sensational West End performance came down to the theater. Betty fully understood why Savannah had taken the chance and stole the scripts. Her plan was logical: hide the manuscripts away until the theater was forced to close, and then Savannah was going to sell the scripts anonymously back to the West End production company. And hopefully, and Betty admitted this was a massive gamble, the production company would still want to host the play at the Bluebird Theatre, which Savannah would buy with the money from the script sale. It was perfect. Which was why Betty had instructed Savannah to put the scripts back into the filing cabinet and pretend they were never stolen. So whatever was said, Savannah wasn't a criminal, and the focus was purely on the captors and the charges of modern slavery.
"What will happen to me now?"
Savannah asked, as she forced herself to look away from the police. Betty gently rubbed her baby bump as the twins kicked in excitement. Betty was about to say something when her sister Phryne came over and hugged Savannah. Betty was pleased that Phryne looked so happy considering Betty had left her precious little performance. "Savannah, it is great to welcome you to the team," Phryne said. Savannah's eyes widened. Betty had no clue if it was out of fear or joy. "The team?" Savannah asked. Betty gestured Phryne to explain. "Of course, my dear," Phryne said. "You are now the proud owner of the theater. A certain detective made them sign it over to you before they were arrested, and now our great charities get to work together." Savannah slowly nodded, then Phryne wrapped her very thin arm around Savannah's chunkier one, and started dragging her down the high street towards a restaurant for dinner. Savannah looked at Betty like a plea for help, and Betty just laughed. It was nice to see her sister get so excited about something for a change. It was actually nice that after all the chaos of late, her sister was doing good, and she was even involved in a charity now. As a delightful breeze of warm air enveloped Betty, she smiled to herself and started to walk down the street towards where Graham went with the captors. She had no doubt the uniformed cops would take them back to the station to be booked, and Graham had the car keys. So Betty needed to be quick, otherwise she'll be stranded in the middle of Canterbury. Definitely not a bad place to be stranded, but Betty just wanted to go home now and enjoy her wonderful boyfriend. Betty kept walking, the rough cobblestone under her feet, and she couldn't believe how great she felt about today. She had helped a theatre survive, saved a woman from enslavement, and even given her a brand new start as the owner of a theatre. If that wasn't a great day's work, then Betty really wasn't sure she wanted to know what was.
Welcome back everyone, it's me again, Connor Whiteley. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's story, because I flat out love writing, creating stories and sharing them with you. If you really enjoyed today's story, then please remember to like, comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content, and the engagement really helps the Whiteleyverse with the YouTube algorithms. And if you want to buy this short story or any of my other fiction, then they're available from all major ebook retailers, and you can get them from your local library if you requested, and you can order the paperback copies from Amazon, your local bookstore or local library if you request it. Lastly, if you want to support the channel on a one-off basis, then you can now buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. Also, if you know anyone who would enjoy today's story, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the channel. So, thanks for watching the Whiteleyverse, and I'll see you again soon. Have a great day, everyone.